Good morning. I've been considering actually doing a series of talks, probably over the next couple of years, on each of our 7 principles in turn. But we'll start with the first principle and then see how it goes after that. This has been a hard talk to write. This is one of those days where I had to show up here this morning because I want to find out what it is I'm going to talk about. So hopefully you all find out along with me. It did not escape me when I saw our March newsletter that we're sort of coincidentally, it looks like, having a 7 Principles theme month, because Denise's talk next week is basically on the 4th principle, and then Ken Sizemore's service the week after that is going to be a celebration of the 2nd principle, so it just kind of works out that way sometimes. But this is the first of the month, so we'll start with the first principle. I'd like to start simply by going over our principles, which are listed in the front of your hymnal if you want to take a look. You don't have to say it along with me or anything, but what our principles say is, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. A part, not a part. We are not apart from the interdependent web. We are a part of the interdependent web. I have personally found our principles, taken as a whole, to constitute a remarkably complete, self-consistent, and interlocking moral code. In fact, several of the other principles arise directly from the first. It's because of the inherent worth and dignity of each person that we advocate and support treating each other with justice, equity, and compassion. These principles were agreed upon by our association and not handed down as law by a prophet or deity sometime in the distant past. Thus, they constitute a living tradition that we can add to or clarify or update as the need arises in the future. As Unitarian Universalists, we don't have a creed, but we do have our principles, which are at the core of what it means to be a UU. And while there's plenty of room for interpretation of their meaning, according to our bylaws, a member of our congregation is expected to be in sympathy with these principles. The principles are not a belief system, but they're a framework around which to build our individual belief systems, or a touchstone against which to test our beliefs. For example, while we're each free to pursue our own search for truth and meaning, wherever that search leads us, to be authentic UUs, we need to reciprocate and to acknowledge that everyone else has that same freedom. So this talk is about my interpretation of our first principle. You may not agree with everything I say, you probably won't. But this is as Chuck sees it. The principle is, we covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Let's start by dissecting the wording. A covenant is simply a formal agreement. There's nothing much more to say about that. To affirm a principle means to assert its truth or validity. To promote it means to encourage it to flourish. So to affirm and promote it means that we not only believe it to be true, but we intend to support and act on that belief. Now let's jump ahead to every person for a moment. I don't intend to argue for or against the expansion of every person to include species other than human. That's a whole different subject. But for today, just to limit the scope, I'm interpreting every person to mean every individual of the subspecies Homo sapiens sapiens, and maybe hypothetical extraterrestrials of similar cognitive capabilities.
Yes.
To put it another way, I'm limiting today's discussion to sapient beings, but not necessarily expanding it to all sentient beings, which is another talk for another day. To say that worth and dignity are inherent is to say that they are part and parcel of personhood. Now, a fundamental principle of economics is that there's no such thing as inherent worth. The worth of something is what somebody will pay for it. In terms of supply and demand, if there's no demand for an item, it has no worth. But we're not talking about economic worth here. We're not defining the worth of a person in terms of their material contributions to society, or even their potential to someday make such contributions, or acknowledgement of their past contributions. We're asserting that each and every person is valuable and adds something to the human experience simply by virtue of their existence. To have dignity basically means to deserve being treated with respect. So we are asserting that because all people have inherent worth, we should treat each other with respect. Now, one reason I've wanted to do this talk is it seems that every time we have a discussion in Talkback or wherever about the first principle, we jump almost immediately to every person, what about Hitler? Now, that may be an interesting discussion topic in its own right, but it's a distraction from more relevant issues. It's a form of Godwin's law, an internet-era assertion that once you introduce Hitler or Nazism into a debate, you've degenerated into hyperbole and rational discussion has ended. So just to get it out of the way, the short answer is yes, even Hitler had inherent worth and dignity, a statement that doesn't in any way signify acceptance of his ideas or actions. But if you're stuck on that, for now, I'll let you hold on to a short list, let's say 20, of sociopaths, mass murderers, and ruthless dictators that you can consider exempt from the first principle. And we'll move on to talking about the billions of people not on that list.
There we go.
So let's talk about why we need this principle, what it says about how we think people should be treated as opposed to how they too often are. The challenge shouldn't be whether to apply it to Hitler or Stalin or Saddam Hussein. The challenge should be about applying it to the disempowered, the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the hungry, the sick, the poor. It's about treating people as individuals rather than as an undifferentiated mass, which begins with seeing them that way. Consider for a moment your life in all its rich complexity. Your experiences, your likes, your dislikes, how they've changed over the course of your lifetime. Jobs you've held, books you've read, movies you've seen, your family, friends, acquaintances who've come and gone, places you've been, adventures you've had, all the joys, triumphs, disappointments, tragedies. It's mind-blowing how complicated your life is. Now, try categorizing yourself in a couple of words. I'm a 60-year-old white male, a phrase that if you saw it in a newspaper article or somewhere would probably evoke a certain mental image. But it doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of who I am. And it's the same for each one of us. Now consider, there are roughly 7 billion people on this planet, and each and every one of them is just as complex and unique as you or I are. I realize what I'm going to say today is in essence preaching to the choir, but please bear with me. A whole lot of putting the first principle into practice is overcoming some natural tendencies that we all have, that are cooked into our DNA. These basic human tendencies include classifying stuff, a need to belong, and separating the world into us and them. Being human, we like sorting stuff into categories. It's just something we do. So of course we do it with people too. We classify people into groups on all kinds of bases. Gender, race, ethnicity, sexual preference, religious affiliation, Okay, I got the same thing in their place. Nationality, political affiliation, you name it. We can't help that. The danger comes when we look at a person and see them as a stereotypical member of a group and think we know all there is to know about them, instead of recognizing them as a unique individual who happens to belong to that group. May belong to various other groups too. Our need to belong can lead us to voluntarily give up some of our individuality in order to better fit in with a group that we want to be part of. We will actually try to conform ourselves to a perceived stereotype. We'll adopt cultural norms, religious beliefs, or ideological beliefs if we think it makes us a better member of our tribe. It's a short and dangerous step from, I believe so-and-so, and that fits reasonably well with the beliefs of that group, so I should join it, to, now that I'm a member of the group, if they believe such and such, so should I. But, and I looked up the pronunciation of this today, but homogeneity, whether or not it is self-imposed, is only partial and never fully defines us, or anyone else. Even within a group, each member is a unique individual who may have some characteristics in common with the group, but who has their own identity and their own life story. It is a natural tendency to divide the world into us and not us, or the other. The fight or flight reflex essential to our survival necessitates such a division. It's so strong that if we can't come up with an obvious basis, we'll make one up. We'll divide people up on almost any basis. The music we listen to, the clothes we wear, our favorite sports team. Star Trek versus Star Wars. iPhone versus Android.
No.
You name it. Sometimes it's all in good fun as long as we don't take it too seriously. But it's because the tendency is so strong that we have to actively work to transcend it. And transcending some of our baser instincts is what civilization and our 7 principles are all about. Thanks to civilization, most of us, most of the time, aren't in high-stress, high-risk, immediate survival mode. Yes, there are exceptions. And when we're not, that's the time to work on overcoming our divisive tendencies. There's nothing inherently wrong with celebrating our membership in a group, whether it's on the basis of our religious affiliation, our cultural heritage, even a favorite hobby or pop culture interest, as long as we do it without denigrating those who aren't in our group. We can celebrate a common interest without declaring all other interests bad or inferior. Just an aside, for a good look at why our fight and flight reflexes don't serve us all that well in the modern world, I highly recommend the book Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Robert Sapolsky. It's a good read. Another thing that comes along with being human is that we are inherently capable of both good and evil. There's a common, but I think somewhat misguided notion that children are born good and have to be taught to hate. But those doing the teaching were once children themselves. Where did they learn it? Unless you believe that it was introduced by aliens or supernatural beings, the capability for hate, like the capability for love, comes along with being human. Children are indeed born innocent in the sense that they are a blank slate. But it's up to us, individually and collectively, to teach them well and to nurture the good in them. I'd like to share 2 illustrations that offer a similar insight using completely different metaphors. If you have a good memory, you'll probably recognize these from another talk I gave. The first is purported to be of Native American, usually Cherokee origin, but there's a lot of debate over whether that's true. I'm not going to take sides on that. It's a good story, whatever the source. An old man is teaching his grandson about life. A fight is going on inside me, he said to the boy. It is a terrible fight, and it is between 2 wolves. And somebody's going to criticize my pronunciation of wolves, no matter how I say it. But one is evil. He is anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego, he continued. The other is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on inside you and inside every other person too. The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked his grandfather, which wolf will win? The old man simply replied, the one you feed. The second one from Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh I like better because it's a kinder, gentler way of saying the same thing. Your mind is like a piece of land planted with many different kinds of seeds. Seeds of joy, peace, mindfulness, understanding, and love. Seeds of craving, anger, fear, hate, and forgetfulness. These wholesome and unwholesome seeds are always there, sleeping in the soil of your mind. The quality of your life depends on the seeds you water. If you plant tomato seeds in your garden, tomatoes will grow. Just so, if you water a seed of peace in your mind, peace will grow. When the seeds of happiness in you are watered, you will become happy. When the seed of anger in you is watered, you will become angry. The seeds that are watered frequently are those that will grow strong. Now, as reluctant as I am to do this, let's go back to Hitler for a moment. You remember that list I let you hold on to? One of the reasons we view sociopaths as monsters is because we need to believe that they are fundamentally different than us. We don't want to admit that under the wrong circumstances, we too might be capable of bad things, though probably not on the same scale. To blame Hitler for everything that happened in 1930s Germany is to effectively absolve everyone else, those who actually carried out his orders. Without followers, Hitler would have just been a raving nutcase on a street corner somewhere. A lot of more or less normal human beings who were capable of good turned out to also be capable of being seduced into evil. This is scary. It's understandable that we try to avoid facing it, but we ignore it at our own peril. That we are all sinners, which is the Christian view I was raised with, I've never interpreted to mean that we are all evil or hopelessly broken, but rather that none of us are perfectly good. As a reminder to stay humble and an admonishment not to be too full of ourselves and to refrain from judging others. As I asserted before, yes, even bad people have inherent worth and dignity. That most emphatically does not justify evil acts, and it doesn't mean that we don't have to defend ourselves against them. Indeed, what is almost the definition of an evil action is one that lacks respect for the inherent worth and dignity of others. To do good is to have that respect and to practice the compassion that it engenders. Recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every person, to me, means appreciating other people as individuals rather than defining them as members of a group. It means that we are here, in Annie Dillard's words, to notice each other's beautiful face and complex nature. An insight I gleaned from reading Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond is that ethnic or racial groups are not inherently superior or inferior to one another. His well-supported assertion is that the ascendancy of one group over another in human history has been primarily attributable to accidents of geography. I think that sometimes perceived ethnic differences become self-fulfilling prophecies. For example, denying quality education to a defined group because of a preconceived notion that they are less intelligent might reinforce that notion a generation or two later when they're less educated. So something incorrectly assumed to be, say, the result of a genetic difference might be purely culturally imposed. My view of society is that our goal should be to enable every person to pursue their dreams and develop their full potential regardless of the circumstances of their birth. One key to that, of course, is universal access to a quality education. Another, of course, is to not put obstacles like racism in their way. If we believe in people and we give them the opportunity to develop their potential, my win-win mindset goes, not only will their individual lives be enriched, but society as a whole will be better for it. While I was researching a talk on Gnosticism a few years back, I was struck by an insight that if you squint at it just right, you could interpret the message of Jesus in the Gospels as not as, I am the Son of God, so if you want to be saved, you have to believe in me, but as a Universalist message, something more like, I am a child of God, and so are you, and if you learn to believe as I do, you'll see that we're all already saved. I'm not saying that's a correct interpretation, just an insight I had. But to me, just the possibility that we might all be part of a divine or sacred whole should be enough to inspire us to accord each other our due dignity. Now I'm going to offer a few suggestions on how we each might better cultivate an appreciation for the inherent worth and dignity of others. Again, I'm quite possibly preaching to the choir here. First and foremost, stay humble. Anytime you're tempted to think you're better than somebody who's going through a hard time in life, or you want to pat yourself on the back for making better choices than they did, even if it's just a private thought that goes through your mind while you're expressing sympathy or lending a hand, what should be going through your head is, there but for the grace of God go I. Or at least the less theistic, there but for a simple twist of fate go I. Often, the only thing separating us from someone less fortunate is that we were dealt a better hand to start with, or simply didn't have a random bit of bad luck that they did. And even if it is because we worked harder or made better choices, so what? We're all just one bit of bad luck away from being the one needing help.
Right.
Life's hard, help each other through it. Recognize that we all have blind spots, no matter how hard we try not to. Be alert for them and work on them as you identify them. One trick I've talked about before that's been useful for me is simply trying to see things from another person's viewpoint. I call this intentional empathy. It's not hard to do, although it's never a perfect exercise, but it requires a conscious effort. Just take what you know of the person, whether it's a little or a lot, and pretend you're them for a moment. Try to look at things through their eyes. If you can gain a little insight into what it is in someone's background or culture that causes them to act or feel the way they do, it's a lot harder to demonize them. A slightly related viewpoint trick is to imagine that you're completely on the outside looking in. Completely. Trying to see the world from the vantage point of an outsider, like Khalil Gibran's prophets say, or an extraterrestrial studying human affairs from afar. I often refer to this as taking the 40,000-foot view. Sort of like the Bette Midler song, From a Distance, that was quite familiar of. Distance yourself from your group allegiances and try to be objective. I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here and offer up an example about one group of people I don't think are generally treated in accordance with the first principle. When I do that outside looking in exercise and strip the close-up emotional baggage from it, here is what illegal immigration in the United States looks like. Begin rant. We have a shortage of low-skilled and semi-skilled labor in this country, in part because of an aging baby boom workforce. Mexico and other Latin American countries have younger populations and a labor surplus. In an ideal world, supply and demand would dictate that we recognize our shortage and issue an appropriate number of work permits to bring in enough documented guest workers to fill the demand. But for whatever reason, probably because there are employers with political pool who like having an exploitable in the shadows labor force, we can't seem to do that. So somebody, let's call him Joe, is born in Mexico, grows up in abject poverty, can't find work, but hears that they're hiring up north. So rather than wallow in hopelessness, he takes a desperate chance, braves innumerable hazards, including, yes, illegally crossing a national border, not because Joe is lazy or looking for a handout, but because he's willing to leave behind everything he's known, go to a land where he's looked down on, demonized, cussed at, and do whatever it takes to work hard and provide for himself and, if possible, for his relatives back home. Joe is probably a devout Catholic. He's not a bad guy. He is, in short, the kind of person who built this country in the first place. If we didn't lump him in with some preconceived notion of what those people are like, And if we were willing to meet him halfway on the language barrier, we'd welcome people like Joe. Make him a citizen eventually, and his kids and their kids will be getting college degrees, starting businesses, and creating American jobs. Are there unauthorized Mexican immigrants who aren't like my imaginary friend Joe, who are drug runners or gang members or violent criminals? Yeah, some, I'm sure. But if we legalized folks like my imaginary friend Joe, it'd be a lot easier to keep out the true criminal element. But even if you don't agree with me, please don't call folks like Joe illegals. You can call them petty criminals if you must, but while actions can be illegal, there's no such thing as an illegal person. Please respect Joe's inherent worth and dignity. End rant. Another suggestion is simply to broaden your cultural horizons by any means available to you. As I mentioned in a previous talk, it was travel for Mark Twain who said, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime." But if you're not in a position to travel, then read. Read books about places you haven't been, books written from points of view you may not agree with. Watch documentaries, whatever you can do to learn to see the world through the eyes of others. Now, a final suggestion is to cultivate compassion by practicing metta meditation. Metta, usually translated from the Pali as loving kindness, is practiced in both Theravadan and Tibetan Buddhism, although it apparently actually predates Buddhism. Typically, it takes a form like, may, fill in the blank, be happy. May they be free from harm. May they be at ease. Where you fill in the blank first with yourself. It always starts with yourself. May I be happy. May I be free from harm, etc. Repeat that for a while. Then direct it toward a close friend or loved one. Someone it's easy to have those feelings about. Then someone about whom your feelings are neutral. Then moving on to someone you don't like and wishing them well. And finally, extending it to all beings. There are a lot of variations on this, but that's the general idea. I'm going to close with a couple of random thoughts. The first is an observation occurred to me the other day. This one is a good news, bad news thing. The United States may just be the most diverse country on the planet. The good news is that while I haven't researched this exhaustively, we are perhaps the best example of ethnic and cultural coexistence in the world, so we should be proud of that. The bad news is, of course, that we are perhaps the best example of ethnic and cultural coexistence in the world, and we should be embarrassed by that. So we can't let this be as good as it gets. As a species, we clearly have a lot of work to do. Second, something I've spoken about before. Anger gets in the way of people being able to appreciate each other. Please find a way to minimize the anger in your life. We can't completely avoid those little momentary irritations, in traffic, for example, that come and go all the time, but as long as we let go of them, that's not what I mean. I'm talking about anger that feeds on itself, a righteous anger that we feel justified in. For some people, it seems to become almost like a drug addiction. They seem to thrive on it, and I think it's reached epidemic proportions. Don't give in to the temptation. By not adding to the problem, you become part of the solution. And finally, I want to leave you with this. When contemplating the first principle, please always remember that every person includes yourself. That to support the first principle means to acknowledge your own inherent worth and dignity. Thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to talk back, and I hope it's not all about Hitler.